acknowledge the infinite goodness which has watched over our existence as a nation and so long crowned us with manifold blessings, and to implore the Almighty in His own time to stay the destroying hand which is now lifted upon us. Consider the difference of the response in 1665 and 1849 to plague versus the response of our nation in the COVID pandemic of the last several years. Why the difference? Then they wanted the churches open. This time, they wanted the churches closed. Why the difference? Let me suggest several reasons. For one, in those days, they held a rather strange belief. They believed that God was actually real, and that His wrath was real, and that His blessing was real as well. And they believed that by praying to God, particularly by assembling in the church to pray to God, His wrath could be averted. Today, government policy concerning free exercise of religion is simply, well, there are people out there that they have religious beliefs and we have to tolerate those beliefs. In those days, they acknowledged prayer because they knew God was real. A second difference is a changing view of church-state relations. In the earlier days, as I'm going to be demonstrating a little bit later tonight, they believed, as Luther and Calvin had taught, that church and state were distinct kingdoms established by God, and that God had given special authority to the church, likewise special authority to the state, and neither could command the other. We've moved instead over to the view of Rousseau that the state is the highest human organism, it is over all things, and the church is simply one organization with many others under the ultimate control of the state. And third, we don't view constitutional rights today as the absolutes that they were viewed by our founding fathers. Instead, we view the Constitution as an evolving document, and whatever the framers might have meant is not binding today. And so, as a result of these changes, as the COVID epidemic began, we saw the closure of many churches, sometimes closed by orders of governors, orders of mayors, orders of sometimes health commissioners and the like. And yet, there was resistance. Some stood up and simply said, no, we're not going to do that. We're not going to close. One of these, around Good Friday of, I believe it was 2020, was a church, and this was a predominantly black church in Greenville, Mississippi. I love the name of this church, King James Bible Baptist Church. And they insisted that they would go ahead and they would have a service on Wednesday night, the Wednesday before Easter, but they would have their services out in the cars. And they had rigged up on the radio, people could listen to the service. The mayor's order was interpreted by the police to say, you can't even do that. And so, as they are there in their cars, listening to the service, police officers coming around giving them tickets. Now, I have to say that there was only one way in which social distancing rules were violated by these actions, by their assembly. The only way social distancing was violated was when they had to roll down their window and accept that ticket. Well, the pastor of that church, God bless him, said to the mayor, you better print up some more tickets because we're going to be having a Good Friday service and we're going to be having an Easter Sunday service. And anyway, the governor of Mississippi came in and he said, you start ticketing people for going to church and we're going to have a revolution on our hands here. And the mayor finally backed off. We had a another instance, something like this, in Tampa, Florida, there was a pastor there of a quite large church. Rodney Howard Brown was his name. And even though he had spent some $300,000 on an air purification system for his church, they nevertheless charged him with violating orders of having to close all non-essential activities. Well, the result of this is Governor DeSantis simply declared that worship is an essential activity, and the charges were dismissed. John MacArthur of Grace Community Church in Burbank, California. And I'm pleased to say that the Oak Brook College of Law, where I am professor of constitutional law and related subjects, that we are actively pursuing a merger of Oak Brook College with John MacArthur's Master's University. After what he went through with the state of California, he said, we need a law school. And we in the law school said, we need somebody who can market us better. And so we have come together, and I think this partnership is going to work. But John MacArthur was threatened with criminal charges and jail for holding services. John MacArthur said, I'm over 80 years old. I've had many different kinds of ministry in my life, and if the Lord's plan for me is that next I have a jail ministry, so be it. He held firm, and his church held firm, and eventually all charges against them were dropped, and the state even had to pay their legal fees. But the assumption through all of this was that the state had power to do this. They just decided sometimes maybe it'd be better if we exercised a little bit of mercy here and a little bit of tolerance and decided to forbear and allow these churches to go ahead and meet. They based their thinking on this largely on a U.S. Supreme Court case, Jacobson versus Massachusetts, a 1905 case. Any of you heard about that case or ever had it cited? Anyway, this case gave the health authorities in Massachusetts the authority to require people to get vaccinations in the face of any kind of epidemic that was to come. Using that case today involves a few assumptions that some of the early courts made, but later courts began to correct. First, as they looked to Jacobson versus Massachusetts, they forgot this case did not involve any claims of religious liberty. Just simply people that said, we don't want to get the shot. That ought to be enough. But religious liberty gives added weight to the objection. And secondly, at this time, the courts were simply saying that government may infringe upon constitutional rights if they have a rational basis for doing so. Since 1905, the court has moved a long distance from this and said, at least when we're talking about fundamental rights like free speech and free exercise of religion, the government needs to meet a much stricter standard, strict scrutiny as it is sometimes called. They have to show that the state has a compelling interest that cannot be achieved by less restrictive means. And I argued from the beginning in these cases that the church-state issues involved with COVID need to be analyzed in light of the new strict scrutiny doctrine, and that at the very least, if not overruled, Jacobson needs to be reinterpreted in light of these new doctrines. Well, there were some early victories that took place as well. For example, in 2020, we had in Louisville, Kentucky, we had an order by the mayor of Louisville that prohibited churches from meeting and came down with an order that there were to be no services, even on Easter Sunday. Well, a Trump-appointed federal judge, Judge Justin Walker, gave quite an order. I'm going to read you a portion of what he said. On Holy Thursday, an American mayor criminalized the communal celebration of Easter. That sentence is one that this court never expected to see outside the pages of a dystopian novel, or perhaps the pages of The Onion. But 2 days ago, citing the need for social distancing during the current pandemic, Louisville's Mayor Greg Fisher ordered Christians not to attend Sunday services, even if they remain in their cars to worship, and even though it's Easter. The mayor's decision is stunning, and it is beyond all reason unconstitutional. And the court enjoined that, and the church was permitted to have its services. Then we had a similar thing just a short time later in Holly Springs, Mississippi. In Holly Springs, police officers disrupted a church Bible study in an Easter service and cited the church for violating city orders. A federal court refused to enter an injunction protecting the church, and on May 20th, the church was burned to the ground. 2 days later, the Fifth Circuit intervened. The Fifth Circuit, by the way, is probably the most conservative of all of the 11 circuits, plus the District of Columbia circuit, and so that's the best circuit to be in if you have a case like this. But the Fifth Circuit reversed the district court and issued an injunction. Judge Don Willett wrote in his concurring opinion, "The First Pentecostal Church of Holly Springs was burned to the ground earlier this week. Graffiti spray-painted on the church parking lot sneered, 'Bet you stay home now, you hypocrites,' which was misspelled. The city mentions the church burning in its latest brief, but in a manner less commendable than condemnable. One might expect a city to express sympathy or outrage, or both, when a neighborhood house of worship is set ablaze. One would be mistaken. Rather than condemn the crime's depravity, the city seized advantage, insisting that the church's First Amendment claim necessarily went up in smoke when the church did, that the church was destroyed from arson, making the permanent injunction claim moot. This argument is shameful. When the parishioners of First Pentecostal Church leave their homes on Sundays, they are not going to church. They are the church. When the church is not the building, when the New Testament speaks of the church, it never refers to brick and mortar places where people gather, but to flesh and blood people who gather together. I like this phrase, think people, not steeple. And then we also had some victories outside the courts, too. The governor of Minnesota, not unexpectedly, issued orders prohibiting churches from assembling in the state of Minnesota. The presidents of the northern and southern districts of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod joined with the president of the Wisconsin Evangelical Lutheran Synod, and joined even with the diocese of the Roman Catholic Church in writing a letter to the governor. In the letter, they note that they had been for months trying to work with the governor to try to work out a suitable arrangement. And they say, "We were thus surprised and disappointed when the governor rebuffed our efforts at coordination and refused to move toward the reopening of churches. That decision is in violation of our fundamental religious freedom and indicates that churches are seen as a less than essential part of society." And so they simply said in their letter to the governor, "Therefore, effective," and I believe it was a date in May, "effective this date, we are going to begin holding worship services whether you approve or not." Well, the governor's reaction just a few days before their deadline went into effect, the governor announced that he was withdrawing his order. And of course, he said he was planning to do so all along. Anyway, demonstrating that when we stand together, often we are successful in forcing the authorities to back down. Now, the Foundation for Moral Law, where I serve as senior counsel, has written a number of amicus briefs in cases involving church-state relations here. Many of our briefs, though, in regard to the vaccination issue, were in regard to the military cases. And in some ways, when you're dealing with the military, you're dealing with a little more restrictive circumstance. It's been clear ever since the days of George Washington that, as Washington once said, and these words are emblazoned in Arlington Cemetery when he said that when we assumed the duties of a soldier, we did not shed the rights of a citizen. And as to the question whether military people are protected by the Constitution that they have taken an oath to defend, the answer is absolutely, they are protected by the Constitution. However, sometimes military necessity may raise a compelling interest that may not exist on the outside. And so sometimes the exercise of constitutional liberties is more restrictive in a military setting than it is outside the military. But we had vaccination requirements in all branches of the service. And I've been with the Foundation for Moral Law since 2008. And I don't think in all of my time at the foundation, we have ever had as many calls about any issue as we did about the COVID issues of closing, and particularly the COVID issues of vaccination, and more than in any other field. And we got these from school bus drivers and so many others complaining about this. One school bus driver, for example, was complaining about the mask requirement. She said, they don't realize that here in Birmingham, Alabama, in August, when school starts, the temperature in a school bus can be about 118 degrees. And especially if you wear glasses, if you're wearing a mask, your glasses are going to fog up. And that's not really conducive to the safety of the students that you're trying to drive to school. She also noted that, and here's what happens with the masks, you have these students wearing the masks. Immediately when they get off the bus, they immediately whip off the mask, they wad it up and put it into their germy pocket and leave it there until they get back on the bus the next morning, when they take it out and put it back on again, just like it was before, and raised some very serious concerns about whether any of this was healthy. We had one case involving, well, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 provides that there can be no discrimination against people based in the workplace based upon race or sex or religion. And it said that religion includes all aspects of religious belief and exercise unless the employer cannot reasonably accommodate the employee's practice. I'll give you just a couple of examples of cases that we had where the issue came, would there be an undue hardship to the employer for him to accommodate the employee's practice? One case we had involved a nurse. This is a nurse, probably 40, 45 years old, who worked in a senior citizen center. And anyway, they'd put in a requirement that he was to get a vaccination. And he said, I have a religious objection to vaccination. My suggestion to him was, well, submit your request for an exemption and tell them that you'd be willing to accept the less severe consequence of wearing a mask, and we'll see whether they decide there's an undue hardship there or not. Then I had another case right at the same time. This case involved a man who worked making parts for the space industry for a company in Texas. And anyway, he was under the same restriction that you have to get vaccinated. He told his employers, tell you what, I can't do it because of my religious convictions. I'm willing to wear a mask. In fact, I'll double mask if you want me to. I only come into the office about once a week. Most of my work I do from home, and so there doesn't seem to be too much of a problem. But when I'm at the office, I'm willing to move my desk further away from the others. I'm willing to put a shield around my desk. And we submitted that with a request for exemption. In which of these two cases would you say there is more likely to be an undue hardship to the employer? Which of these would be more difficult for the employer to accommodate? The nurse who is working in close proximity to elderly people in a nursing home, or actually a senior citizen home, I should say, or a man who is making parts for the space industry working mostly from home? You think that, honestly, I thought the nurse's case might be a little difficult. I thought the guy in Texas, I thought that was going to be a slam dunk. In fact, they immediately told the nurse, wear a mask and you're exempt from vaccination. The guy in Texas, they fired. Well, we were able to get a very good settlement for him, $31,000. And the reason it wasn't more was that 2 months after he was fired, he was hired by another company at a higher salary. But anyway, but the point of the matter is, as people were adjudicating these questions, is there an undue hardship to the employer by accommodating people who have religious objections? There was just no rhyme or reason to how these were being decided. But the military had said that we have a military necessity that all of our people be safe from the COVID virus. They can't function in a military setting, especially in a wartime setting, without it. And so we have to require vaccination of all of our military personnel. And so we had military personnel being discharged because they refused to obey the order to get a vaccination. We had military personnel who, one of the first cases took place in Texas, which is in the Fifth Circuit, fortunately. And this case was a group of Navy SEALs who objected to the vaccination on religious grounds and took this case to a judge in Texas, Judge O'Connor. Judge O'Connor ruled that the Navy could not enforce this regulation upon them. I immediately got a call from another legal defense foundation asking if we would write a brief on behalf of an Air Force officer in the state of Georgia. And we'd be glad to. I'm a retired Air Force officer. Am I willing to write a brief against the Air Force? Absolutely. And as I said in our news release after it was done, as a retired Air Force officer, I love the Air Force. But I also love the men and women who wear Air Force blue. And I think they are entitled to the protections of the Constitution they have taken an oath to support and defend. Well, we had that case. We had cases involving the Marines, the Coast Guard. We did not have any actual cases with the Army. But anyway, what we argued, particularly in the Air Force case, was that the Air Force was willing to grant exemptions for people who had medical reasons for not wanting to be vaccinated. Maybe they'd had a reaction to a previous vaccination, or maybe medical doctors said that it would be dangerous for this person to be vaccinated. And so they had given thousands of medical exemptions. And they gave administrative exemptions. Exemptions for people who, for various reasons, vaccination would not be practical, but no religious exemptions. Anyway, we argued that by granting the medical exemptions and the administrative exemptions, they had forfeited the argument that military necessity prohibited them from granting religious exemptions as well, unless they could prove that there was a danger in religious exemptions that did not exist with medical and administrative exemptions. I love the way that Georgia judge, who was he was a former Army gunnery officer, but I like the way he put it in his order. He said, those who are unvaccinated for religious reasons, those who are unvaccinated for medical reasons, and those who are unvaccinated for administrative reasons, all have one thing in common. They're all unvaccinated. And the Air Force, he said, has utterly failed to show any reason why the exemption that they are granting for administrative and medical reasons cannot be applied for those with religious reasons as well. Anyway, we had several decisions that in the circuit courts in the 5th and the 6th and the 11th circuits that went in favor of military personnel who were objecting to vaccination. And finally, back in January, when Congress passed the DoD authorization budget, they included a rider there passed by a narrow margin saying that the requirement of vaccination is rescinded. Now, Biden did not like that one bit, but we don't have such a thing as a line item veto, and I know a lot of conservatives like the line item veto. I think it could be a very dangerous thing. But anyway, Biden had no choice. He'd have to veto the whole bill, which was basically impossible, or sign it into effect, including this provision, and so he did. And so, for the most part right now, military personnel are off the hook. And then we had several cases involving church closures that went finally to the US Supreme Court. Roman Catholic Diocese of Brooklyn versus Cuomo, and South Bay United Pentecostal Church versus Newsom, that's in California, of course, and Harvest Rock versus Newsom. In all of these cases, the Supreme Court ruled that these governors had exceeded their authority when they ordered the closure of these churches. I love the way Justice Gorsuch put it in his concurring opinion. He said, even if the Constitution must take a holiday during an epidemic, it cannot become a sabbatical. In other words, if we're going to have emergency powers like this, those are going to have to be narrow, and they are going to have to be brief and very restrictive in how they can be applied. And basically, they said that if churches are being treated worse than other agencies, in other words, if we're allowing people, an unlimited number of people to shop at Walmart, but only 10 people together in a church, if there is any inequality like that, then the government is going to have to apply the strict scrutiny, compelling interest, less restrictive means doctrine. This was, to some extent, quite a victory, but not totally, as I'm going to show in just a little bit. Question now is this. Even though we've had some victories here, have we learned anything from these epidemics? We're going to have more. You can be assured that more epidemics are going to be coming. One of the things that I'm going to strongly suggest is that at the legislative level, we need legislative action in just about every state in the country that restrict the governor's emergency powers. Now, they need emergency powers, I grant you that, but they need some restrictions on it. And as to how to restrict those powers, what they can do, how they can, and under what circumstances, if any, they can violate constitutional rights, how long the emergency powers can continue, under what circumstances they can be extended, all of these need to be considered. In Alabama, our governor in Alabama is kind of a good old girl, you might say. She could be worse, but could be better. But she had issued an order that was so vague, it had all these terms in it that made it basically unenforceable. Basically, it would say that businesses must, if reasonably possible, take practical steps to inform, and on like that. So many exceptions written into it. There was a cartoon that was published. It showed her giving a press conference in which she summarized the order by saying, "Y'all stay home now unless you got to go someplace," which is basically what the order said. But I'm going to show you a case here that we are taking the foundation. And most of the time we're filing amicus briefs, but sometimes we are actually taking courses or cases to court and representing the party ourselves. We just had one, didn't involve COVID, but this seems like it's a replica of the era 60, 70 years ago. It was in Selma, Alabama. We had a street preacher on Halloween who was arrested for preaching on the street. And anyway, the statute under which she was prosecuted was a statute that really came from the civil rights era that had been used to prosecute civil rights demonstrators 60, 70 years ago. This was not a racial issue this time. The street preacher was black, the arresting officers were black, the prosecutor was black, and the judge was black. So this was not a racial issue at all. But we filed a motion to dismiss the charges. One of the things that this pastor had done, which was very, very wise and commendable, is he had his sister with him, and she had videoed everything that had happened throughout the whole thing, including the arrest. And it was clear from the video that he was not being disrespectful. He was speaking through a loudspeaker, but not shouting, screaming, speaking loud enough to be heard. When the officers approached him, he regularly addressed them as sir, and when they said, "We need to see your permit," he said, "I don't need a permit because I am legally allowed to preach." When they insisted that if he had a microphone, that he needed a permit to preach with a microphone, he said, "Well, then I'll preach without a microphone," and he set it down and began preaching, but they wouldn't let him do that. His sister then asked the officers, "Well, could he go and preach on another corner? Would that be all right?" No, he's got to stop. And so they handcuffed him and put him in the police car, took him off to jail. And anyway, so we filed a motion to dismiss. We argued that the statute was unconstitutionally void for vagueness, especially as applied here. We argued it was a violation of his free speech and his free exercise. And so we came to court several weeks ago. And anyway, there in court, we were waiting for the judge. And as we're waiting for the judge to call our case, the prosecutor came and he asked to see us in the back room. And so we went to the back room there, and he said, and if you understand how many times city court runs, you'd see this is not all that unusual. He said, "I know you filed a motion to dismiss a while ago. I haven't had time to read it. But anyway, tell me what it's about." And we explained it just like I've explained it to you. And he said, "Well, we don't want to prosecute somebody for preaching here, and I'm going to move to dismiss the charges myself here. But I need to talk to the officer first." Came back after talking to the officer, and he said, he's agreed we can dismiss the charge, but he wants to make a statement to the court. And so he made a statement to the court, and he said, the police, we recognize he has a right to preach here, but he also has to respect the rights of others as well. He can't get in their faces. He can't be shouting. He can't be insulting them. And meanwhile, Ricky is sitting next to me saying, I was being respectful. I wasn't shouting at anybody. I wasn't getting in anybody's face. And I said, "Yes, I know that. But look, you've won. Right now it's time to be quiet until we get out of the courtroom, and then we'll talk all we want." And anyway, so we have cases like that regularly, but this is one involving a pastor in a pastor in Louisiana. Tony Spell is his name. He has a large church there in Louisiana. And when the governor issued an order that prohibited any churches from holding services involving more than 10 people, this is a church that holds hundreds. It's a huge church. But he said, "I must obey God rather than man." And he continued to hold services. As a result, he was charged service after service. He had all kinds of charges. He was placed in leg irons and arrested and released finally. They had video cameras set up around his home and around his church and so on. Anyway, we were defending against the criminal charges in state court. In the meantime, we had filed a motion, or rather a lawsuit, against the governor in federal district court. Well, the case went up to the criminal charges went up to the Louisiana Supreme Court, and they ruled that the governor had exceeded his authority, and therefore the charges were illegal, and they dismissed all the charges. Now, here is one of the things that they based their decision on. They noted that there was a provision in the Emergency Powers Act in Louisiana, and this provision had been inserted by a very fine conservative Christian state senator, Woody Jenkins, that simply said that nothing in this act shall authorize any government official to violate any citizen's rights under the United States Constitution or the Louisiana Constitution. And that being the case, the Supreme Court said clearly, this does not authorize you to close the church and prohibit services. And so the orders that the governor has given, as they apply here to this pastor in this church, are unconstitutional, and they dismissed the charges. Well, the state thought maybe we'd just kind of walk away from our federal case, but the answer was no, we would not. And we are in the process of preparing a petition for cert to the U.S. Supreme Court because we are arguing to the U.S. Supreme Court that the decision of the Louisiana Supreme Court was a great decision, as was the decision of the Court of Appeals, but they don't go far enough. You see, first of all, what they are saying is that churches are simply asking that they be treated equally with businesses, grocery stores, other people like this. And they must be given that equal treatment. Our answer to that is, in part, you look to the free exercise clause of the First Amendment. It doesn't talk about free exercise of shopping, or free exercise of drinking, or free exercise of gambling, or free exercise of doing business. It is free exercise of religion. In other words, religion is not on an equal plane with other activities. Religion, under the First Amendment, is in a preferred position. But we're arguing further than that when the framers drafted the First Amendment, in which they said Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, they understood church-state relations in a jurisdictional sense. They understood that church and state were not just two entities that relate to one another for the governance of mankind. Rather, they were two divinely established agencies. As Luther put it, for example, and remember, this country was settled by colonists in the 1600s, the century right after the Reformation. And they came from the background of Luther and Calvin. And as Luther had put it, these two kingdoms must be sharply distinguished and both be permitted to remain, the one to preserve external peace and the other to promote the Word of God. Neither is sufficient in the world without the other. Or as Calvin put it, let us first consider that there is a twofold government in man. One aspect is spiritual, whereby the conscience is instructed in piety and reverencing God. The second is political, whereby man is educated for the duties of humanity and citizenship that must be maintained among men. There are, in man, so to speak, two worlds over which different kings and different laws have authority. This idea of two kingdoms goes back to the first people that I can find in history to practice separation of church and state. I'm talking about Old Testament Israel. And when I use that term, separation of church and state, I'm using that term in a proper sense, not the improper sense in which many radical separationists would use it today, but in the proper sense. Back in Old Testament Israel, for example, the kings of Israel came out of the tribe of Judah. The priests, the religious authorities, came out of the tribe of Levi. Separate offices, separate jurisdictions, but both derived their authority from God, and both were under the authority of God's law. And this concept goes into the New Testament as well. When Jesus, for example, is asked about the payment of the tax, and of course this is a trick question. If he says, yes, pay the tax, his popularity in the next Jerusalem poll is going to be down about 90 points. And if he says no, they're going to immediately go and tattle to the Romans. So either way, they think they have him. But instead, he says, show me. I'm sorry. He says, show me a coin. And they do. Whose image is this? Caesar's. And he says, render therefore unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's. Lord Acton says of this statement of Jesus that here he gave to the state a legitimacy the state had never before recognized, but also placed on the state a limit that the state had never before recognized, that there is a jurisdiction that is beyond his authority. And Lord Acton said, keeping the church within its appointed limits. became the perpetual responsibility of the church. We see this idea of the two kingdoms throughout the Middle Ages, and I know we seem to think that there was a lot of improper interaction between church and state during the Middle Ages, and certainly there was, but they did recognize there were two kingdoms. They based this in large part upon the passage where Jesus says, "Whoever lacks a sword, let him sell his garment and buy one." And two of the disciples come and say, "Lo, here are two swords," and Jesus says it is enough. And these two swords in Catholic theology through the Middle Ages represented the sword of the church and the sword of the state. Pope Gelasius, for example, declared to the Roman emperor in AD 496, "Two there are, august emperor, by whom this world is ruled, the consecrated authority of priests and the royal power. Of these, the priests have the greater responsibility, in that they will have to give account before God's judgment for those who have been kings of men." And Pope Boniface VIII referred to the two swords passage again in AD 1302, when he said, "We are told by the word of the gospel that in this fold there are two swords, a spiritual, namely, and a temporal. For when the apostles said, 'Behold, here are two swords,' when namely the apostles were speaking in the church, the Lord did not reply this was too much, but enough. Surely he who denies that the temporal power is in the power of Peter wrongly interprets the word of the Lord when he says, 'Put up thy sword into its scabbard.' Both swords, the spiritual and the material, therefore, are in the power of the church, the one indeed, the sword of the state, to be wielded for the church, the other, the sword of the church, to be wielded by the church, the one in the hand of the priest, the other in the hand of the kings and knights, but at the will and sufferance of the priest." Notice what they're saying is that, yes, you have these two kingdoms, church and state, but the church is the superior kingdom. But Luther and Calvin say neither kingdom is superior to the other, because God has established each kingdom with a distinct function, and neither kingdom can dictate to the other. One of the points that we make in our brief is this. Let's suppose that Pastor Spell in Louisiana had simply ordered the closing of all government offices. People would look open-mouthed at that. What are you talking about? Where do you get any authority like that? He has no authority to order the closure of government offices, nor does the state have the authority to order the closure of the church. Understanding that the framers come out of that Reformation background, but also understanding that the two kingdoms concept is not simply a Protestant concept, but a Catholic concept as well. We need to point that out because 6 of the Supreme Court justices, including 5 of the conservative Supreme Court justices, are Catholic today. And so we need to point that out, that there is Catholic support for this two kingdoms concept as well. As James Madison, man who many would call the prime architect of the First Amendment, in fact, he is the one who introduced the First Amendment on the floor of Congress, in his memorial and remonstrance against religious assessments. This is a very important document in American history because it demonstrates how the framers regarded church-state issues. This involved a state law, that proposed state law, that would have the effect of taxing people for the benefit of all Christian churches. And anyway, Madison objects. And in his objection, his memorial and remonstrance, he says, "In matters of religion, no man's right is abridged by the institution of civil society, and religion is wholly exempt from its cognizance." He goes on to say that before anyone is a citizen of a nation, he is first of all a citizen of God. and his responsibilities of God cannot be ceded to civil government. And then he goes on to say, as to this requirement of a tax to pay for the support of the church, he says, the Christian religion, which we believe to be of divine origin, does not need the aid of the state. I would add it does not need the opposition of the state either, but the point he is making is he is not objecting to these assessments because he is against Christianity. He is objecting because he says the Christian religion is of divine origin, and therefore it doesn't need the aid of the state. Then he goes on to another interesting point, and that is that if we're going to say this goes to the support of all Christian churches, then the state is going to have to define what is a Christian church. And he says the state has neither the jurisdiction nor the competence to make that determination. He says, for example, are papists, that's the word he uses, are papists Christian? And many in Virginia at that time would have argued absolutely not. Are Quakers Christian? Again, many would have said absolutely not. And are Socinians, Arminians Christian? Well, maybe a little more question about Arminians than Socinians or Arians, but in other words, he's saying the state would have to define who's a Christian if they're going to decide who gets this subsidy and who doesn't. The state does not have the competence or the jurisdiction to make that distinction. On another occasion, Madison was asked as governor of Virginia to approve the incorporation of a church, and he said, I can't do that because the state does not have any authority over the church. I don't have the authority to approve this, nor do I have the authority to disapprove it, because it is a wholly different jurisdiction. Thomas Jefferson's statement about a wall of separation between church and state, when it's properly understood, is not really a bad statement. It's been misused time and time again. But what Jefferson is actually saying here to the Danbury Baptists at this time is that you Baptists have no reason to be afraid of this new federal government, because there is a wall of separation that protects you from them. Now, he would have said that the wall also protects the state from the church, but in the sense he is using it there, it protects the church from the state. On another occasion, Jefferson says, believing with you that religion is a matter which lies solely between man and his God, he owes account to none other for his faith or his worship, that the legislative powers of the government reach actions only and not opinions, and I contemplate with sovereign reverence that act of the whole American people which declared that their legislature should make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. On another occasion, he writes, I consider the government of the United States as interdicted by the Constitution from intermeddling in religious institutions, their doctrines, disciplines, or exercises. Certainly, no power to prescribe any religious exercise or to assume authority in religious discipline has been delegated to the general, that is, to the federal government. Now, we have a case from 1947, Everson versus Board of Education, in which Justice Black uses that phrase, wall of separation of church and state, but I find it very significant what he says here. He says, the establishment of religion clause in the First Amendment means at least this: neither a state nor the federal government can set up a church. I think we'd all agree with that. I don't want Biden heading up a church. Neither can pass laws which aid one religion or all religions, or prefer one religion over another. Neither can force nor influence a person to go to or remain away from a church against his will, or force him to profess a belief or disbelief in any religion. No person can be punished for entertaining or professing religious beliefs or disbeliefs, for church attendance or non-attendance. Isn't that exactly what Louisiana did? Punished people for church attendance? Tried to force people to go to or remain away from a church? What we're telling the Supreme Court in this case is what is really needed here is more than just this debate as to whether or not we judge these cases on the basis of rational basis or on a stricter basis of strict scrutiny. What is really important here is not a conflict among these lower courts as to how to adjudicate them on that basis. What is really at issue here is a conflict between past decisions of the court and the intent of the framers of the Constitution. And the court at this time needs to get back to the plain words of the Constitution and the intent of the framers and view the Establishment Clause in light of this two kingdoms concept, which is the way the framers viewed it. And our hope is that the court will hear this case. Granted, out of the cases that go before the court, as I was telling them earlier this afternoon, the court receives about 10 to 20,000 petitions each year. They will accept only about 100, so mathematically, the chances of the court agreeing to hear this are not very strong. However, we're hopeful, and what's happening more and more is if the court decides not to grant certiorari in a case, sometimes justices will dissent from the denial of certiorari. Particularly Justice Thomas has been doing this recently, and Justice Gorsuch occasionally as well. And we're hoping that even if they decide not to hear this case, that there will be a dissenting opinion that will express some of the sentiments that we've been expressing here. But the point I'm trying to make is, as we look to this issue of quarantining the church, it really goes much deeper than just the question of what basis the state might have for restricting churches. It goes to the question of what really is our view of God and his role in human affairs. Is he just somebody that we have to accommodate people who are wanting to pray to this supposed God? Or is he real? And do we actually want to be asking for his favor and wanting our churches to be open and asking for his favor and his mercy in crises like this? And what do we mean by church and state? Just two institutions that the framers are thinking about occasionally? Or are they kingdoms established by God, each with distinct jurisdiction? That's what's really going on right now. The issue is certainly not going to go away regardless of what happens in our case, and we hope for your prayers. Do I have time for some questions, David? Let's take a few questions, and who'd like to be first? Nobody's willing to be first. We'll just skip the first question and go to the second. Okay, you'll have the second question. Joe? Joe, go ahead. Very often, dissenting opinions become the basis for majority opinions at a later time. And they focus attention on issues. This is probably even more true when the issue, see, when the court denies certiorari, they're not saying we agree with what the lower courts have done or we disagree with this petition that's been presented. They're simply saying that this is just not going to be one of the 1% that we're going to hear. And if other justices are saying this raised issues that we should be considering, there is language in there that we'll be able to quote in future cases. It'll also be the basis for law review articles and other things like this that will get this issue more before the legal community. And there is good scholarship that we have available, but unfortunately it is outweighed in the legal education today by the radicals control the vast majority of the law schools. I assure you they don't control Oak Brook, they don't control Liberty, Regent, and Ave Maria, and several other good law schools, but the vast majority of law schools today are in the hands of the radical, not just liberals, but the radical left. And so getting basis for more legal scholarship in this area, dissenting opinions many times will find the basis to be quoted in later decisions of the Supreme Court when the majority in the court changes, or when they recognize that This person who dissented at this time really had something that we should take much more seriously than we did then. So dissenting opinions can have value for the future. Okay, good question. Are there other questions? If not, I will turn the service back over to David Barrett, and I thank you for the chance to be with you here tonight.
Well, thank you, John. So we're going to bring tonight's meeting to a close. I just want to remind you that the book tables will be open for a little while if you want to peruse, or John will be here for a little while if you want to speak with him as well as Israel. And then we will begin at 9 o'clock tomorrow. I'll have the doors open about 8 o'clock. You can come in and look at the books and socialize prior to the meeting, but we'll start at 9 o'clock. We have a full slate of both general sessions and workshops. You can pick up a schedule off one of my book tables. So why don't we stand? We're going to close in prayer, and then you can be dismissed. Thank you, Father, for this evening and the message that was given, and for the encouragement of the work such as the Foundation for Moral Law and others are doing to fight for the rights that are not only guaranteed, or I guess I should say protected by the Constitution, but are rooted in your very word. Father, be with us tonight to give us good rest, and as we gather again tomorrow to continue in the theme and the teachings of the conference, Father, bless and be with us. We pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen. You are dismissed.